Chushim, and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Hanoch, Abida, and Eldar. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai-roi. These are the descendants of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave girl, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedema. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. This is the length of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. He settled down alongside all of his people. These are the descendants of Isaac, Abraham's son. And Abraham was the father of Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it's to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterward his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore he was called Edom. Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "I am about to die. What use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank, and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Firstly, apologies for the dodgy pronunciation therein. I did my best. What becomes very clear in this is that Abraham was the father of many nations, and you find that he had his other wife, Keturah. It gives the impression here, the way that it's laid out, that he married after the death of Sarah. Quite possibly he had her when Sarah was alive as well. We're not quite sure about the Hebrew is unclear. But I think what the first few verses I want you to see is that, coming up to the death of Abraham, is that Abraham was the father of many nations, of Keturah and her children, Ishmael and his children. But of all these, of course, what it wants you to see is that Isaac is the son of the promise. So that Abraham was the father of many nations, but Isaac, and that's great, but Isaac is the one for whom the promise was going to happen. And so you kind of see that he had these other children, but he gives preference to Isaac throughout, because he is the one who's going to have the promise. Lovely, it sort of ties it up here with the death of Abraham dies, and he's buried with his wife Sarah, and his brother and his sons Isaac and Ishmael gather together for the burial. It's quite a nice picture of some degree anyway, family reconciliation here. And he says he was buried with a good number of years, and he had a good life. You can kind of give it a nice little obituary going on here. So here you have the death of Abraham, the father of many nations, with Isaac as the son. But then here you see the transfer, if you like, from here in, Abraham disappears from the picture, and the emphasis now becomes on Isaac, the son of the promise. Okay, so we move on then to Isaac and Rebekah. And what is quite interesting is that they get married when Isaac is 40 years old, which is quite old in those days to get married. But if you look carefully, it took them 20 years before Rebekah conceived and gave a son. Because it says here that Rebekah was barren. And again, this is quite interesting because it tells us something about the struggle which faith is sometimes. That, they knew that it was God's will. God had said he was going to make Abraham the father of great nations, and Isaac was going to be the one through whom it was going to happen. And there'd been the incident when the sacrifice, which didn't happen, and so on. And it became very clear, and God had made it abundantly clear that the promise was the great nation was going to come through Isaac. And yet, she couldn't conceive. And it's something similar, of course, had happened with Abraham before. And then, of course, it says that Isaac prayed, and that God answered the prayer, and that the children, Rebekah conceiving is very much an act of God. It's a gift of God. God has done this. It shouldn't have happened by rights because Rebekah was barren, but God did it, and so it was an act of God. And yet, even then, Rebekah, having conceived, and she then has 2 children inside her. And there's clearly huge sibling rivalry, and it's going on even in the womb. These two inside her womb are clearly fighting it out in there, and she's seriously distressed by this because it's happening, as I say, inside her very womb. And so she inquired of the Lord, it says, and because you'd almost have thought that God's promise is fulfilled, God gives this gift of God, and yet even then it still turns out to be troublesome, and it tells us really of the struggle which faith is. We have to learn patience. We have to learn that God does things in God's way and in God's time. And by golly, that's a struggle. It really is a huge struggle for us. And then even when God's prayer, God delivers it, and even then it can be troublesome, as Rebekah was finding here. So see here, and read it again read it again, and see that the struggle which is going on for Isaac and Rebekah, and their struggle, and then these 2 sons are born, Esau and Jacob. And again, it's fascinating there with them really. They are certainly flesh and blood characters. Esau comes out sort of seriously hairy. And I guarantee in Hebrew the word Esau is very similar to the word hairy. It's like I'm sort of calling him hairy. It's a description of what he looked like when he was born, but he loved him for that. And Jacob comes out hanging onto his brother's heel. And the word Jacob, from which we get the word James, means usurper or cheat, basically. And essentially that's what Jacob did. Jacob was a serious wheeler dealer. And as we will discover in the next few chapters. And so you've got Esau and Jacob, and they're not, as I say, they're not particularly characters that God's chosen to fulfill his promise. It really is. And yet, for some, and yet you see that Isaac loved Esau more because he liked to eat, and he liked this. Isaac was the hunter, and yet Rebekah preferred Jacob. The Bible is quite clear about that, as we find out again in a couple of chapters' time. But actually, in the end, God says the younger will serve the older, which is kind of not the way it's happened in those days. And it's interesting to read because, I think Jacob actually wasn't a very nice person, as we will discover in the next few chapters. I don't think he was a very, very pleasant individual. But God loved him. And I guess God loves who God loves. But I think what's interesting with Jacob is that he has got huge determination. From the very off, he wants the best. And he wants to succeed. Esau gives up, he's hungry one day, and can you give me some of that lentil food? And give me your birthright, says Jacob, not missing an opportunity. And then Esau sort of says, well, what's the use of birthright to me? He kind of gives up, blah, 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 blah. What Jacob had in spades is determination and stickability. And Jacob wanted God, and Jacob wanted to get ahead. And so we tend to think of that as not a very nice characteristic, but actually in God terms, actually, when Jacob wanted God, Jacob struggled and agonized, and Jacob had huge amounts of determination. And actually, that's really important in the Christian life. We tend to think of sort of Christians as sort of nice people who are very terribly humble and give and a bit too pliant. Actually, what we have in Jacob is a flesh and blood character who wants to get ahead, and spiritually wants to get ahead as well. And you see that much of that in the next few days. So, what do you have in this chapter? This transfer of the influence of emphasis from Abraham to his son Isaac. You see, firstly, that Abraham is the father of many nations, but that Isaac is the son of the promise. Secondly, you have the struggle, the faith struggle, which Isaac and particularly Rebekah have, praying inside God's will, but God does things in God's way and in God's time, and by golly, that's a struggle at times. And read it here, as you can get here. And then you've got the two boys, Esau and Jacob, and we'll hear much about them in the next few days, the flesh and blood characters that they were. And let's learn from the character, in a sense, the stickability of Jacob. And let's be prepared. Let's make sure that we hang on to our faith and that we don't give up too quickly. And that we have some of his determination. But lots of that in the next few days. God bless you. Thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely weekend. God bless you. Thanks for watching. Forward these messages to your friends so they I'm sure they will enjoy them too.